Hello, everyone. Welcome. Use the chat. If you've watched before, you know what I'm going to say. Use the chat and tell us where you're tuning in from. And we'll let a few more people get logged in before we start. I'm in Seattle. Sonia's in New York, I think. Asma's in London. Where are you? Seattle. Hello, Jean. Give it another few seconds here. London. Hello, Anne. All right. I think we will go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome. I'm Laura Hamilton. I have a cookbook shop here in Seattle, Washington. It's called Booklarder. We have just started to do some in-person author talks again, but are also continuing to do author talks on Zoom because we get to have conversations like the one today, where our interviewer is in one city, our author is in another, and you are tuning in from all over the place because see, Ashia is here from New Zealand. So there you go. I am really honored to get to welcome Asma Khan. She is a restaurateur, founder and chef at Darjeeling Express in London. And of course, you might also know her from Chef's Table, the Netflix show. And she is the author of now 2 cookbooks. The latest just came out today, AMMU. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for what is now the launch event for this cookbook. It's a really marvelous book that Asma is going to discuss with Sonia Chopra. Sonia is the executive editor at Bon Appetit, and the two of them are going to talk about the book and Asma's career, and they're of course going to leave time for questions. So please be sure to use that little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, hi Sonia, for questions as you have them, and we'll leave time for those at the end. The talk today is also being recorded, and so we will have that up on our YouTube channel in the next 2 days or so you can watch it again or share it with friends. But now I'm going to turn things over to Sonia Chopra and Asma Khan.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much, Laura and Asma. Thank you so much for joining me today, and congratulations on the launch of your beautiful book, the US launch this week. It's so exciting, and I know you were just in the US and are now joining us after possibly a red eye. I'm not sure, after a flight back to the UK. So thank you for making the time.
Thank you. This is very exciting. My US launch. It's a real privilege. Thank you so much.
And for everybody listening in, please do use the Q&A function, like Laura said, if you've got questions, and we'll get to them in the back half of this. So Asma, I guess I'll just get started. For people who aren't so familiar with your book yet, do you mind just telling us really broadly what your elevator pitch for it is, just a little bit about the book?
This book is dedicated to my mother. It covers, it's 5 chapters covering 5 decades of my life. It's really a conversation about family, love, South Asian roots, you know, why we cook, the women in our lives. But there's something very universal about this. I think that there is an AMMU in everyone's life. May not be the same person, but that anchor in your life, the person you eat meals with, the person who makes you feel healed over, you know, a conversation on a table. So this is really about that person in your life who, through food, has this deep connection and in some ways restores you and heals you.
I love that. And the book is obviously just so beautiful and so personal. And I know it's your second cookbook, is that right? And I'm just curious, like, was it easier to write than the first? Was it harder? And kind of, obviously, a lot of us are coming out of 2 very difficult years. I'm just wondering, where exactly were you and what was going on in the world while you were writing this book?
Well, I think like a lot of authors whose books are coming out now, because of the kind of time it takes to get books published, these are all our pandemic babies, because most of us wrote this over the pandemic. I wrote this over a pandemic. Very, very different from the first book. And this is a great question. No one's asked me this because my book came out in London more than a year, a half month ago, and it was very different. The first book was written without any idea of how books work. I just was excited, and I wrote this book, which was very successful, did really well. I think, of course, helped a lot by the fact that it came out just the same time as Chef's Table's announcement that I was going to be the first British chef. Uh, and the book was cooked. There were people cooking from the book all around the world. This was much more raw, very. It was written at a time of great darkness, as all of us went through this kind of time of everything closing and stillness. As a restaurateur, I lost my entire business, and 35 people lost their jobs in my restaurant, and the borders closed. And every other day you heard about people you knew who were very ill, people who passed away. 3 people passed away in my own family. And I think I had this book in me always. So this second book cannot be compared to anything else that happened in my life. I wrote this at nights, driven by passion, by fear, by memories, lots of laughter and a lot of tears. I think you'll sense that when you read the book, because I wrote this as almost a love letter to AMMU. But at a time of huge insecurity, I realized how important food is, that it anchors all of us. And you saw this, with people making banana bread in England, and sourdough. And people just went back to some kind of very emotional comfort food that they were creating, because now you couldn't actually go out to restaurants and you couldn't go into supermarkets and buy whatever you wanted. I think in some ways people understood what a privilege it was to eat.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to read you something that you wrote at the beginning of the book. You said, "In some ways, this cookbook is like my jewelry box. As a bride, these were the gifts from my family as I left home. I really discovered their value over time, not their financial worth, but their emotional value, the links to family, to my heritage, and to storytelling, to AMMU. These chapters tell the culinary journey of my life. Just like the box, which is filled with layers of memories ready to be handed over to the next generation, this book is also layered with recollections. I wrote these recipes to open my heart and share my stories with you. I hope that as you go through this book, you can also return to your own food memories." So I think that really speaks to what you were just saying. And I just love how you phrase that. I was a pandemic bride. I got married in July 2020 and didn't do the whole Indian thing that had been planned, and ended up eloping with my husband, and just the 2 of us. And it was so different than that kind of traditional jewelry thing. And so personally, this really resonated with me, but that's not what this conversation is about. I think the sentiment behind this, that recipes are really something to be treasured and passed down, never hoarded or forgotten, that's so special. And I think it really touches on how recipes are both so personal and so global, right? You write these things and you can really, you want people, like you said, to kind of find their own memories to them. And I guess I'm just curious, if there was one feeling or one takeaway that you want people to really have after reading through this book, which again is so personal, what would it be?
I think it's the importance of communication. If you are lucky enough to still have parents and grandparents, talk to them about the recipes, because once they're gone, it's lost forever. And I think we always think that, our mothers and grandmothers will be there forever. And also I think all of us think, because most of us, especially when you have teenage kids, they're so duh about food. They don't seem excited. They don't seem passionate. But this is my imprint that I will leave on the souls of my children. My food, and even if one of them, my younger one, is not so excited about food, I will give him time. I think we all sit and watch television, and in this kind of fractured life that we all lead, not of course in the pandemic, we were stuck all eating together. But I think finding that time, I think that's the one takeaway I think people should really take away from this book, is that I talk about all those memories I had, food related, with my mother. But this is a time of no television, of no mobile phones, no streaming of things that you could watch on television, and no kind of conflict of timing. We did eat every meal together. And I know this is quite hard in today's world, but find that time, because you're leaving that gift of memories.
And of course, there's a through line in your cookbook about the diary that you kept when you were living in India and then brought with you to Cambridge. It's actually, do you have the copy in front of you, if you don't mind just showing?
No, I'm so sorry. I don't, because I have no idea where it is. I think it actually could be in my office, in my restaurant. And because I've just arrived from, anyway, you know the story. I just arrived from the US. I couldn't find it. So I discovered very late that actually it's in my office. I'm sorry.
It's a beautiful cookbook, and you write in the book that the beautiful embroidered cloth cover of this diary that you kept when you were in India and moving to Cambridge is what inspired the cover of that. And you even include inside the book a photo of the diary and one of the recipes inside it. I think it's from 1989, alongside your recipe for shami kebab in the book. And I just thought that was so special and so amazing. And you had just kind of said, like, one thing that you want people to take away is their own food memories. For cooks at home today who are interested in preserving their own family recipes, not all of us have those notes, you know, from when we were growing up or when we were kind of transitioning in our lives to a new. Yeah, I mean, look at it. It's just gorgeous.
There it is.
Even the cover of the cookbook is just so lovely. And I guess I'm just curious, what steps would you recommend that people take if they want to get started documenting their own family recipes?
So if you are South Asian, Asian, African, from Latin America, all our mothers and grandmothers give terrible instructions. It's so random. I think that, you know, as we are in a new world with technology, I think, you know, you start off by filming them. And, you know, this is how you can start making notes by actually having conversations in the kitchen. I think that's a lot easier to start off. And then exactly like that shami kebab recipe, which is so, you know, just random things that I wrote down because that's how I was being told. And of course, if you look at the actual recipe, there I've given you timings, I've given you proportions, as opposed to the diary, which is like, you know, all the list of just ingredients and no explanation because I just watched it, but I never wrote it down. You know, whichever way you're easy with, if you can write notes, you know, do capture this because I think the pandemic was such a lesson for so many of us that how temporary everything is, that everything can be shut down. And the one thing that remains is this memories and love that we all carry within us that we take for granted in a lot of times, that this will be there forever. The pandemic taught us that nothing is there forever. And, you know, for many families lost loved ones. And I think that, you know, just before we came on and you talked about this whole, you know, your marriage. And, you know, whatever you may have thought about happening, you know, for your all singing, all dancing wedding, it was very different. So all of us had to compromise, you know, something we never imagined you would have to do. You would think that you have the right to do everything you want. And then the pandemic told you that you can't. So I think that these things are important, that you capture them forever, write them down. You are gifting the generation coming after you these memories. And not everybody can get their cookbook published, but if you put them in the diary, you know, you never know. My diary eventually became my cookbook.
I love that. That's so true. So speaking of your book, you've arranged each chapter around a specific theme, kind of, so that readers can really create their own menus from within each chapter for feasts, about comfort food, for family dinners, rather than by type of dish. So you get everything from snacks and hearty mains to desserts, even in chapter 1, which I really enjoyed. And you also, at the beginning of the book, you include these menus for your own specific kinds of meals, whether it's a date or a dinner with the first time you're meeting your in-laws, or a barbecue or weeknight cooking. And I was so taken by your approach. I think a lot of the times you really see things organized by ingredient, or, you know, kind of progressing through a meal chapter by chapter. And I'm just wondering, did you always know how you wanted to frame the book? And can you tell us a little bit about how you put it together?
It was very important for me because I felt that by suggesting menus for events where I kind of guessed, because I've been through all those events, you know, it's a birthday, it's a date night, it's your in-laws coming, you're doing food to impress, you're doing food to heal. I thought it would be helpful because it was also about, you know, trying to figure out, you know, how much time you needed. You know, I didn't want you to spend your whole time, you know, completely frazzled cooking. And everything has been set up to work in a normal kitchen. So, you know, no one has a commercial kitchen with 3 ovens, two cookers, you know, huge amount of fridge space. It doesn't work that way, you know. So this is really a book for everybody. You don't have to have lots of stuff even in your fridge, and simple ingredients. So I just wanted to kind of hold their hand and kind of suggest things, because this food is about building bridges with your loved ones, because the story is about the the person I love the most in my life. And I wanted this to be about love and food and conversation. And so I just thought it'd be good to pick things that I would pick. So I just imagined that this is going to happen to me. What would I want to cook? And it just made sense to put it down, because as I was writing, I was thinking, oh, this really goes with this, because unlike European food, where all the flavors are complementary, in South Asian food, the spices are working against each other in contrast. The Ayurvedic concept that, your palate has all these spaces in there that need to be stimulated, astringent, sour, sweet. We don't have this idea of one meat and two veg. It is really about a combination of, different flavors. And that's also what I was trying to do without going into the complications of, trying to explain, I have this spice and that spice. I let me do that for you. I'll just tell you what works. And it is a kind of really like an explosion of flavors. It's like a kind of spice odyssey that you go on. And that's why I tried to suggest these menus. And I hope people will find them helpful.
I, for one, loved it. I thought it was really refreshing and really helpful. And I myself am South Asian, and even I sometimes think about just like you, part of my family's from one part of India and part of my family's from another. And you're always kind of thinking about how things fit together and the different spices and things like that. So it's always really nice. Another thing that I loved about your cookbook is that so many of the recipes offer these small tips to use leftover produce or suggest canned ingredients instead of fresh ones as a way to save time or money when it's relevant. So if you have dried fruit past its prime, you can make a pulao with raisins and cashews. If you have a leftover bag of spinach, you can add that to raita. If you can't afford or find fresh fish for the machi kebab, you can use canned salmon. And I think, especially right now, where here in the US, we're just really feeling inflation. It is at an all-time high. It's, our grocery bills in my household have doubled. It's so refreshing to see this approach in a cookbook. And I think that a lot of people really do think about Indian food and South Asian food as something that is really inaccessible or unapproachable still to this day in 2022. And my hope is that these little small things that you've done as part of this really beautiful narrative do help kind of push on that a little bit and show that that's just not true. And so I'm curious, was that approach something that was also top of mind to you as you selected and wrote recipes for this book?
This is a gender thing. All our women, our tradition, so they're just, we have a word in Hindi called jagaru, which is like putting it all together somehow, and this has to do with our culture where, people turn up unexpectedly, you turn up with your whole clan when you were just the only person invited. People do this without any thinking in our culture. And this whole idea that you make do and you make shit, just manage somehow. And I think the other thing is that, it's a very hot country. You don't have things always there in the larder. And one very secret thing that happens, which I think a lot of people outside South Asia don't know this, that for most households, the food budget is given at the beginning of the month. Amount of money that you save is yours. No one's going to account for it so usually the way patriarchy works, the men in the house give you the money and you are then in charge of the kitchen for most women. So we come from that deep-rooted culture of making do and, just survive. There is a recipe in this book of vegetable peels. This is so common in Bengal, using potato peels, pumpkin, courgette, zucchini, as you all call it, just putting it all together, deep frying it in ghee and with chilies. Come on, what's there not to like? But, they do it without making it. But in the West, there are all these labels to it: sustainability, no waste. There's this big thing about meat-free Monday in this country. And in India, there's always been a day where there's no meat available in the market. And everybody had a meat-free day. And it was just effortless. And this whole idea that you make it into this kind of project and you brand it, we don't do that. So what you find in this book is really natural, very, very rooted narrative about how women cook. Women in my culture, in the whole of South Asia, we cook without drama. We cook not to impress, but to heal. And there's a huge respect for ingredients. That is what I was trying to reflect.
I love that. And as you've just said, you say early on in the book that until you left India in 1991, you had never eaten a vegetable out of season because that's just not how it was done. It wasn't for any sustainability reason. It wasn't branded in some major way. It was just how you got foods at the markets, right? And
Yeah.
of course, now in India and across the world, it is easier to get many ingredients out of season or in places where you can never find them before, but that's not true of everything. And I'm curious, are there any ingredients that you still find really difficult to track down in the UK that you really miss? For me, it's mango season in Bombay, where my mom is from. So for me, of course, the answer is Alfonso mangoes, which are my favorite.
We are lucky because in England you get all the Alfonso and the all the mangoes from Ratnagiri. I know it doesn't come to America, but also it is mangoes for me. It's the mangoes from my region in Bengal. Those are mangoes that don't travel well. They bruise. So the langra, if anyone remembers the scene of the mango orchard with my father in Netflix, we discussed this and I talk about langra, which is a particular kind of very, very fragile mango. I yearn for that. That mango is my entire childhood. It is my father. It is the mango orchard. And that you don't get in this country. So it is also, ironically, mangoes, although you do get different varieties. So I should really not be so greedy and just want that particular one. And the other is a kind of like a berry. It's called jamun. I don't know what the English word is, but it is these little kind of very tart berries, and you don't get that. So there are things that you don't get, but I think compared to America, which has very strict rules about what you can bring in England, we're lucky because we can get a lot of fresh produce from India. And I use it at home, but I just want to say I never use it in my restaurant. I don't make a song and dance about it, but I do not have okra and jackfruit. I do not have anything that is, flown in cling film, sent through, chilled, refrigerated lorries, because this is my thing about carbon footprint on my restaurant menu. So at home, as a luxury, I go and get some ingredients from the Asian area, but I don't use anything flown in from India of fresh produce. And I think I'm probably the only restaurant in the UK that doesn't do it. I think that this is going back to, our roots, Sonia, I'm sure that your grandmother, these are the whole idea that, use what you can, stay humble, eat within your means. And this has to do with us, all South Asians coming from a hot land where things would go off very soon. Fridges came very recently to our country. Not everybody still has a fridge in the house. I forget the freezer. The first time I saw a freezer, I thought there was a dead body in it in Cambridge, because that's all. I only saw freezers in morgues. I couldn't imagine. For us, a freezer is like a small glove compartment of a car in our fridges. So very different. And I just think it's great to be able to communicate through this book, this whole idea that of simplicity and, us valuing food differently.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear too about your restaurant and what you're bringing in and what you're not. I think another thing in the US that's really hard for people to source is curry leaves, curry patta. There's something that it's hard to find them fresh here across the board. And I just started growing them in my kitchen. So I'm hoping, before that I was having my mom send me some sprigs every month, kind of pressed and dried from Atlanta, to a 2-day trip in the USPS. So I'm curious, are there other ingredients like that you're either growing yourself so that you can use them without that carbon footprint, or that you've just kind of, that are so kind of integral to the way that people might think about some kinds of South Asian food, but that you're just simply not using?
So we are so lucky with curry patta, because I think that the difference between fresh and dried is just, it's not worth using. In fact, I tell people, use fresh kaffir lime leaf, frozen kaffir lime leaf. So even that is still better than using dried. Dried is like puff. It doesn't have any flavor. We are very lucky we have, but I'm also growing curry patta on my windowsill. And thank God my cat, who eats everything else up, hates curry patta. He kind of recoils when he goes near it. It has such a strong thing. So I'm so glad. It takes forever to grow. Unfortunately, England, the weather is so horrible. You can grow nothing. And so I don't grow my stuff, but I'm very lucky that I can get everything. But I do grow my curry patta, and the dream is to use it to make halim, which is a Hyderabadi dish, garnishing it with curry patta. So my leaves are still a bit teeny tiny, but when they grow, I'm going to make that, and that's going to be my huge achievement. I'm going to use my own curry patta.
I'm keeping a ruler next to mine because they told me I can't harvest the leaves until it reaches 8 inches. I don't know.
Yes, you can't. Even I'm waiting. But all of this. But it's crazy how these little things, Sonia, you and I have, so different countries, different backgrounds, but just us, what connects us. It's just so, this thing of curry patta, I'm so uh, emotional listening to you that you're growing it. I know lots of people are growing it around the world, and I think it keeps us humble. It makes us understand that, you don't have the right to have every ingredient. You are not the master of everything. There are things that you cannot get, and then you wait for it to grow 8 inches before you can use it.
I hope mine grows that hard. But yeah, I totally agree. And I guess I'm curious too, just to kind of bring it back to your book. There is this kind of perception of, like I said earlier, of Indian food being something that isn't so accessible, or something that is, there's so many layered flavors and so many very particular spices and these things, and curry patta, and things that are difficult to get. And I'm wondering, your book is so personal and it's so rooted in these family connections. And did you think at all about your audiences, your readership's perception of South Asian food and Indian cuisine? And were there any stereotypes that you kind of intentionally set out to disprove?
Yes, I have. You do find that throughout the book where, I explain about korma and I talk about, how the whole idea that you infuse oil with with the pop, with the sound of the spice. Once you've infused the oil, I use a lot of dried red chilies and not chili powder. So it's really about infusing the spices that you have in the food. And yes, I've thought about the audience because this is not an ego trip. You want everybody to be able to cook from the book. And so many people have already, because the book came out in England already, so many people have been cooking around the world now. And it looks incredible. It looks just like, it should. And even with my first book, it, I had no idea that it would be, people would be cooking from it from around the world. I was writing a book for London, and then Chef's Table happened towards, the end of the book when it was already in press. So the only thing that they changed was the cover. Otherwise, this is exactly the book as it was written. And the misconception about Indian spices and Indian food is really about, I think, our lack of people who speak about our food, coming from this deep-rooted knowledge that comes from cooking with mothers and grandmothers. Sadly, a lot of people on television are men who learn to cook in culinary school. And they make it look more complicated. They make it look like there's so many spices. No one cooks with, a cupboard full of spices. We don't have refrigeration. And they're cooking in stainless steel empires with all these gizmos and things. You need just a knife and very basic stuff for all my recipes. These are the original recipes of women who cook. Chefs, those who are on television, if you look at all their CVs, they all learned in culinary school and they all trained in five-star hotels in India, where they had access to everything. We didn't have access to everything. So the recipe is simple. It's quick. It's so hot. You can't have, something cooking the whole night. It's just going to curdle. So it is, I think the problem is that our food is not, we still need to tell our stories. And for this, I'm very grateful to Book Larder, to you, to give me a chance to talk to people about the fact that, it is not that difficult. We haven't had a chance to tell how easy it is. And I don't need to add quick and simple on my cover for it to be quick and simple. It can be aromatic, it can be complex, it can be beautiful, but it's quick. This is how our food is.
Yeah, I love that. And I think the other thing is, because of the way media works, I myself would consider myself part of the media, but I think it's so easy for people to really focus on the dominant narrative, right? Which, of course, when you think about South Asian food, is Indian cuisine, and it's mostly North Indian cuisine. And so to have this really beautiful kind of emphasis on Bengali food on both sides of the border, and to really kind of hone in on that region, though of course you do talk quite a bit about the rest of South Asia too, including some Afghani food and things like that really beautifully, Hakka cuisine, and talking about those different parallels. I think that's just so special and so important to help broaden that narrative and make sure that people are really getting a full picture of everything that a cuisine has to offer, and how different a cuisine can be inside that broad range.
And the other thing is, it's like, saying I'm going to go out and eat American food or European food. And the whole idea that people think there's something called Indian food, my mind boggles. What is Indian food? Starting from, you go down 3 villages from my father's village, they temper the dal differently, and they will be appalled to hear how you do yours. And it's just, the regionality is huge. There's almost a city and village based cuisines. This is to do with the temperature and what is growing locally around you. This whole idea of refrigerated lorries carrying food around didn't exist. You didn't have supermarkets. You couldn't buy things online. Our cuisine grew from really just what was local. And the regional aspect of it has not been explained. People cook in restaurants what is easy to batch cook, mass cook, reheat in a microwave. This is why Indian restaurants have 85, items on their menu. This is so divorced and so separate from what is really our food. The food that our women cook is the food of our land.
Another thing that I think is so interesting about your book and so beautiful is the way that you kind of talk about each recipe. And one thing I was curious about putting a book together, like when you were naming your recipes, how were you thinking about that regionality versus the phrase that might be more global? So as an example, like tadka, right? Like some people say tadka, some people say chonk, some people say any other number of words. And just when you're trying to strike that balance between the personal and the global, and a book, which is a publisher buys in order to make money, and these personal narratives that you're driving and these stories that you want to push forward, where do you kind of draw that line? Or is there an example of a time when you had to kind of balance, the more common name of something versus one that you use at home? It's just so interesting.
The tadka, which we call baghar in my family, is the best example you could have given, that we all have different terms. It was very difficult. Because what I tried to do is I tried to stay true to the recipe. So when I was talking about a Bengali recipe, I used the Bengali terms. When I was using recipes from North India, I was using the Hindi or the Urdu. I'm Muslim, so we have a lot of our food has got Persian words and Persian terms, and I tried to explain that as well. It was quite a challenge to. This is a great question, because it was a challenge to try and figure out, am I going to have a kind of universal way of describing everything? And I thought, no, when each recipe is coming from a different area and has a different story, just like the chapli kebab, I explained this whole idea of where the word comes from, chapli, and, trying to talk about it, or khamiri roti, which is this, the East bread that was made for, soldiers essentially in Mughal times. I used all the words and the terminology to that recipe, because otherwise I'd have gone mad to try and find alternative words to try and make it, same. And actually, our food is not that. So this is why I've used words to that region and to that area, and also to my recollection of how it was explained to me by my mother.
I love that answer. It's so complicated. I oversee a website, and this comes up if we have a recipe developer from Gujarat versus from Delhi versus from here versus from there. When they turn in recipes to us, they all use different words. It's tough on the internet, because you also want to make sure people can search for things and tag them and find the right one.
It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare. And especially this kind of thing, and this regional thing, oh my God. And people are like, you use the wrong word. I was like, I use the word that I know, and people fight with me so often. People fight with me less now because they think I know what I'm talking about. But in the beginning, I was to get so much grief from people. Like people telling me, why is this dal yellow? Why isn't it black? I'm like, do you understand that dal is something so regional? The fact that every Indian restaurant makes black dal is because it can be cooked all night and frozen, which other dals can't be done. And I was like, this is they developed recipes that work. The fact that also naan is served in every restaurant. Who makes naan at home? Who has a bloody tandoor? Your house will catch fire. And imagine setting up a whole tandoor, which is like a big barbecue, to make 6 rotis. It was done. These are things that were developed, literally for mass cooking in restaurants. I went to a restaurant to eat naan in India, to an outdoor tandoor place, a Punjabi restaurant. This was a treat for me. Tandoori chicken and naan was what we all went out to eat as, outside food, something like a treat. You didn't make this at home. But it's this idea, It's like, trying to fight the tide. The common idea that people have of our food is not our food.
I mean, that question about dal is wild. Just for people who might not know, that's probably akin to saying, how come you used pesto instead of red sauce for your pasta? Or how come you use spaghetti instead of macaroni for your pasta? It's like there's just so many different different versions. So I thought that's a wild example, and I'm sorry that you were asked that question. People do love to get angry about food, of course, because it is so personal. It is so tied to people's identity. So it's always tough to strike that balance. Thank you for your thoughtful answer. Okay, so another question. I think you write about eating and cooking during monsoon season so beautifully in your book, and in recipes like the pyaz ki pakora and the eggs and the tamarind gravy. And I think I've never lived in India, and I've never been there during monsoon season, although I usually do go once or twice a year to Bombay and to Delhi, where my family is. But there is something, for some reason, that feels so nostalgic about monsoon season to me, even though I've never experienced one myself. And so I was wondering, since it is such a kind of a big narrative in your book, if you could maybe talk a little bit about why that's such a notable time of year, and what makes it so special to you in your cooking.
No one else asked me this, but now that you asked me this, I think monsoon had that same feeling of being trapped as being in lockdown. And this is why this feeling that you couldn't go out, you couldn't go buy stuff, you couldn't step out of your house. There was a time in London where, you were not allowed to go out unless you had a reason. And in France, you had to have a pass to go out. So, there were all these limitations that were being put on people, buildings being locked down, areas being, in India that happened, that entire building was locked down because of outbreak of COVID. And this idea that monsoon did exactly that. There was water at your doorstep. You couldn't go out. The bazaars were closed because of things. And you didn't have all these ingredients. And then I spent a lot of time sitting at the window and watching the birds that must have lived here forever, but I'd never heard them. Because the traffic stopped, suddenly I saw all these birds in the tree outside my house. I live in central London on a very busy street. And this is what we did in monsoons. We sat and we watched outside the window. The rain was relentless. My father would sing, and we would have these, healing things, warm things. And you appreciated it a lot more because you knew that rations had been limited in the house. And it's exactly what happened in lockdown. And I wanted to communicate this idea of how food, music, stories, being with family, trapped in some ways in the house, but then where the food becomes a celebration, the food is something that you suddenly value a lot more because you know that it's not so easy. And we all went through that, with shortages and, not being able to get food and not getting, in England, we couldn't get flour, we couldn't get eggs. My kids who were born in this country were having a meltdown. I said, listen, that's when I was telling them, I said, I read out the monsoon chapter and they're actually both emotional. They said, oh, we hadn't understood. I said, you guys don't understand. You've grown up in the West. You're London born children. You're having a meltdown because you don't have eggs, you don't have flour, you don't get delivery slots, so you can't get everything you want. Let me tell you what monsoons does to us. It's exactly that, but for a different reason. And I'm glad you enjoyed that because it's something I so precious. It's so hard to explain. It feels like the whole earth is saying thank you because till then it's parched. And that aroma of the earth getting soaked in that rain, so hard to explain, but once that aroma stays in your soul somewhere forever. It's that distinctive thing that you can't forget.
That is so special, and I would have never put that parallel between the pandemic and monsoon season together.
But thank you for asking because I hadn't actually fully understood. I was still trying to understand my book in some ways, and this is so nice that you asked this because this is why I wrote about monsoon because it was the same thing of being trapped.
Yeah, I love that. I'm glad that you had the chance to answer it, and you were just talking about your children, and I think that sparks a new question for me that I hadn't had written down, which is, of course, in your book, you start talking about these recipes from your mother and learning to cook and all of these things. And you kind of, I'm sorry, I don't remember if it's definitely the last chapter, but towards the end of the book, you talk about your modern recipes and cooking for your own kids. And I think that kind of framework and that parallel between the two is just so special. And I'm wondering if there's anything that you want to say to kind of tie that
Yes,
together.
it is the last chapter. You're right. It is when I am Ammu, and it's not that I'm doing fusion food or doing things which have got a twist to it. It's not. Basically, one of my kids is an amateur boxer, and for Asian families, and I think that everybody will understand this. We eat a lot of carbs, and the idea that they were not going to eat carbs freaked me out. They're like, we don't want to eat rice, we don't want to eat bread, because for us that's our main thing. You eat rice and something with rice. But these are kids who are born here. They were like, oh, we need to eat. We want to eat protein, and so I just these are the recipes of things that I cooked that we also make in our families, but it's a side dish or something that you eat with other things. But you always eat with rice. But I thought of things that you could eat on their own. But I thought it was important as well for like the time when you may or may not have children or may not want, but if you have children, you've got kids that are born who are, and I am first generation. Your children will have the same accent as you. Mine don't. Mine are you know different from me, but they also want to eat differently from me sometimes. And I thought that I should write this for people who are in my position, whose children want to eat differently. But it's so important for us to cook. This is our part of our legacy we leave with our kids. Uh, and I just thought it would be a chapter. But even, not for your children as well. I think for friends as well, when you want to be, more inclusive, sometimes our food can be very carb heavy, or, not everybody wants to have everything. And this is also very efficient for time. So if you want to have something cook something quick, it is extremely, nourishing. That's the other thing that, quick food doesn't have to be just stored and, stuff that, is not healthy. You can, and these are all super healthy stuff, all of salads and greens and nuts and beans. We all eat like this in India, but people's perception is, khali dal and butter chicken. My God, if I put so much butter and ghee in my shoe, it would taste nice. We don't eat like this. It's such a regional thing, And I just want to, suggest recipes without all of this stuff, because we don't. There are places where you don't get, the reason why a lot of it is vegan and thing. Not that I'm making an effort to put dairy out. It's so hot. You don't have grass. You don't have cows. Where are you going to get milk to put in your food?
Yeah, I actually, you said this, and first of all, I did try to cut ghee out of my diet a couple months ago, which was very difficult for me as a half Punjabi woman, and it is it is back in my life, which is good for me. But when you in your book, you kind of call it modern recipes, and it's, I don't know what this says about me as a second gen kid, but I assumed fusion. I assumed, oh, okay, that's where we're going to see the uttapam pizza or the the bengan bharta with cheddar cheese on top, or those like quick snacks that like I would eat out of the fridge when I didn't want to spend too much time. There's a line in the book about the green beans, I believe, that you can eat hot or cold and there's something quick. And I actually really appreciated that these aren't, not that there's anything wrong with fusion or with modernizing a recipe, but these were really framed as just the things I'm actually making at home. There's nothing kind of out there about it. There's no like special twist or anything. And I thought that was actually really refreshing in this world where everybody's trying to have a viral recipe or like the next TikTok trend or whatever. And I thought that was kind of nice and kind of grounding to remind people that like, FYI, like here's what we're eating. Here's what my two busy kids who need a lot of protein are eating at home. It's special.
Yeah, and the thing is that you don't need to. I didn't want to give it that thing, twist of that it is something so unique. We actually cook like this, and so many of us do it because it's fast, it's easy, it's efficient. It's also cheap. That's the other thing, that is cheap. And this is great if you've got a kid going to college, to teach them some of these recipes. And if you've got a busy life, you come back, and I think it's so important that you look after yourself. All of us are burning ourselves, trying to please other people and just exhausted, trying to live up to images, trying to have this ideal social media life. Don't do this. Please eat well, be happy, nourish your soul and cook.
Yeah, I love that. And it's a good reminder, I'm sure, to all of us. I definitely had a cold tortilla with some peanut butter on it for lunch today, so we're doing fine. Another thing that you write in your book is never be afraid to experiment. Once you start to cook from one of my recipes, it is no longer my recipe, it's yours. You are bringing to that recipe a part of you, your unique touch, your little twists and touches to accentuate something you want to highlight in that dish. And inside the book, you've included some recipes that you made, like we were talking about when you were first learning how to cook. And there's a question from the audience. Is there one recipe that you think is a good way to start getting into the book if you open it for the first time and you're just looking for something to cook?
I think you should cook one of the kormas, either the fish korma or the chicken korma, because it also, because the protein can be changed to tofu, to anything that you have in your garden or your allotment, as we call it in England, where you have grow beans. If you have a glut of anything, or you just decided to buy just huge amount of aubergine, eggplant from the farmer's market. So the korma I'm trying to explain, which is the base, like even the Navratan korma, which is nine vegetables. We all have these random things in our fridge. One pepper, one zucchini, half or something, and so the kormas are great dishes to start with, because also they are the spice level, the chilies is less. So if you have a family, or you yourself don't want to have chilies, the misconception that all Indian food is super fiery, I don't know where this came from. It came from men who don't know how to cook. But anyway, let's leave that aside. But it's so the kormas are great, and also because make the pulaus, because once you actually learn how to get your rice fragrant and aromatic, it's a game changer. Because if nothing else, rice is cheap, can cook. You don't have to watch over it. Once it's infused and you put it in on slow, it will cook. And it's just so comforting. You can just, fry eggs and eat with that rice, or just have a salad. It gives you all that. So the pulaus and the kormas are great ways to start cooking from this book.
I love that answer. And I'm also curious, you in that chapter when you're kind of talking about learning to cook and experimenting, how, if you're new to cooking Indian food, or you're new to cooking South Asian food, like what are some of the ways that you can really start to experiment beyond, I think, your example of how flexible kormas are and swapping out proteins and stuff like that? Like, what are the ways that you could really put your own spin on dishes?
You can change everything. No, honestly, because the whole thing is, if you actually read that recipe, and then there's a soul in that recipe, which I explain in the recipe, that the caramelized onions are really important, or the garlic and the infusion of chilies, or cumin and the roasting of cumin, the garam masala, and of course, please make your own garam masala if you can. All of this I emphasize in the recipe. Then you can innovate, because I think the most expensive ingredient you put in a dish is your time. That you cannot buy again. You can buy every ingredient again. Your touch, your fingerprints, they are unique. You taste, your sensibilities. This is your recipe. So I think that you should take it, not get intimidated by it. Own the recipe, read it, and there are stories in there. Read it out to yourself. This is like as if I'm sitting there and I'm talking to you. I imagine that people will read this book and feel I'm there with them. And I'm there to cheer them on, because in the end, that you are cooking and you are in some ways connecting to my people, me, my land, is an honor for me. So I think I just want people to feel that they are comfortable with this, not get intimidated, not feel that this is some alien thing. There are enough people teaching you how to hate others. This is my language of love. And that's how I want you to use the recipes.
I love that. Thank you. And then one last question from the audience, and then I think we'll throw it back to Laura. This question is from Ashia, and she says, I love how we're all in different countries but have a connection through food. She's also South Asian and lives in New Zealand. And she says, how do you feel living in a Western country and trying to explain to people all the time that Indian food is not all the same?
I don't get overwhelmed by it. And I also don't feel that, I need to go to every battle I'm invited to. So there's a lot of stuff I let pass. Otherwise it would be crazy. So there are a lot of things I see in media. I'm not one of these people who's like this, who goes into every, event and conversation and gets involved, because, that would be soul destroying. I try to keep my conversation open-hearted. And living in the West, I had to go through my whole journey where food became my way of going home. And that's what I think has kept me very grounded. And I think that being here is great, because today the food in India is so depressing. Indians are just aping the West. You get sushi in Calcutta. My God, I mean, it's a disaster, in a hot country, but people are just aping the West because they don't understand and don't value their own food. So on that basis, I would much rather be in London than be in Bombay, where everyone is modernizing and everyone is, so obsessed about MasterChef Australia and, cooking with different techniques and, all this fusion, let's grate some, truffle on naan. Why destroy the naan? So I'm actually very happy being here, because it allows me to actually talk about food without all this additional confusion of what people think is Indian food in India today.
I love that. Thank you. And Asma, I think that's our cue to throw it back to Lara. So I'll just say thank you so much. This was such a special conversation, and I'm so excited for your book and for everybody in the US to learn about it and buy it from Booklarder. So I really appreciate you taking the time, especially.
Thank you, Sonia. I love talking to you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Sonia, that was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for putting so much time and energy into it. I really appreciate it. And Asma, congratulations on the book. I was sitting here sort of flipping through it while you two were talking, and I have marked like so many things. In fact, I'm going to make this tonight, the gobi masala, because I have a head of cauliflower that I really need to use, and that looks like a really straightforward way to cook it that I've never tried before. So I'm very excited.
And it's going to be delicious. It's, and a lot of the recipes they're straightforward. And it's really to encourage you, go into your fridge, go into your kitchen, see something, come back to my book, you will find a recipe or you'll adapt it.
Yeah. So much to try in here. So congratulations. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us from everywhere today. Like I said, we've recorded this conversation. It'll be up on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. And stay safe and healthy, everyone, and happy cooking. Thank you for joining us. Bye.